Well, for me, Mendable is a safe space, whether it be, in an app, in a community, wherever it is, for people to really share themselves and be accepted for being themselves.
I have gratitude in the fact that I made it through.
So all of anxiety, every form of anxiety, is a sense of losing control or loss of control.
But if you can throw out that energy of positivity and kindness and smile, it changes the world.
Today's guest is a perfect example of somebody who's achieved some great things in his life, despite some fairly significant challenges that could easily have held him back. So it's my great pleasure to welcome here Liam O'Dell. And Liam is joining me today at my home here in South London. Thanks for coming over, Liam.
No, thank you for inviting me down. It's great.
Yeah. So Liam is a freelance journalist. He's created his own career as a freelance journalist. He's done TED Talks. I think he's done a few interviews like this. He's also been a big advocate and activist for the deaf and disabled community, and most recently a published author. And in November of last year, 2024, his first book was published, Selling Out the Spectrum: How Science Lost the Trust of Autistic People and How It Can Win It Back. So, Liam, firstly, many congratulations on the publication of your first book.
Thank you very much.
And I say first book because I have a feeling it may be the first of more.
I very much hope so, yes. I have no immediate ideas just yet, but there's a few that are kind of cooking away in the back of my mind that once I have the time to sit down and go through them, I probably will put pen to paper again.
Now, as a graduate with a university degree in journalism, you did launch yourself into a journalistic career. Was writing a book something that was always likely to happen? Was it a natural next step?
It was always something I wanted to do. It was a childhood dream of mine growing up. I distinctly remember my careers advisor saying that journalism, or kind of pushing me in the direction of journalism, because it felt like the kind of most likely profession to allow me to do the type of creative writing that I really enjoyed. And so that was kind of the way in which I could make a living out of writing, but there was still that kind of underlying desire for years now to write a book, and it's there, and it's still weird looking at it in front of you now.
Great. Well, again, congratulations. And with Liam's background that I described, it's probably no surprise to learn that Liam is actually himself autistic and deaf. Yes. So those are some of the challenges I talked about. So being somebody that's experienced ASD, autism spectrum disorder, firsthand, was that really what challenged you to write this book specifically?
Yes, so it's interesting that I first started investigating a study called Spectrum 10K before I had a diagnosis of autism, whenever I had my autism diagnosis. And so there was a little bit of me that had to be mindful of that fact that I was a non-autistic, I say in inverted commas, person investigating this study around September 2021, which is when I had my diagnosis. And it was interesting looking into this community. I had a lot of friends that were autistic. It was probably, again, another indication that I might be autistic myself. And so, this study, it was interesting looking into it and seeing just where it went wrong. And I knew I wanted to, when it came to a book, wanted to serialise that and have a more kind of permanent record of it, which would be the book. And then the publisher said, well, we maybe need to just expand that out a little bit more so it's not just kind of a full-blown expose, if you like. And so it really posed bigger questions that I then thought would be a more interesting springboard to look at, which is where we get into the conversations around trust, where we get into the conversations around honest communication with one another. And that became a broader investigation that then spans the whole breadth of the kind of scientific research industry, from the funding organisations to the research journals to the advocacy groups, really just looking at all of the different stakeholders within autism research and expand out the question. And it produced a book that I hope answers that question of repairing that relationship, of which Spectrum 10K is an example of a broken relationship. But also I think that the solutions really do speak to non-autistic people as well, because the book looks into how we take accountability for our actions, how we have honest conversations with one another, how we embrace change. All of these different ideas that, yes, they are kind of coming from the background of autism, but they can speak to us all.
Right. Now, one thing, you mentioned the word diagnosis, and I was going to ask you actually if you had been diagnosed as a child, but it actually was when you were an adult that you received that diagnosis. And I was going to ask you, is the word diagnosis the correct word? Because when I hear the word diagnosis, I tend to think of an illness, and autism is not an illness. It's a condition. Yes. And it's not something that can be treatable, but it's something you have to learn to live with. And I think, these are some of the educational points that are really helpful for people to know about in understanding the condition.
Absolutely. There is a kind of differentiation in the disability space between the so-called medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And very briefly, the medical model is around this idea of diagnosis, is around this idea that the disability or condition you have is what disables you, whereas the social model would argue that it is actually the kind of built environment and attitudes that are what disabled us. So, for example, a common example that's given is around a lift or around steps. If a wheelchair user was to go into a building and only steps were available, the medical model might argue that it is because they are in a wheelchair and because they have a mobility impairment, a physical impairment, that is preventing them from going up the stairs. When in actuality, the social model argues that actually it's the built environment. It's the fact that that building didn't consider the fact that there are wheelchair users in our society, that they haven't designed a ramp to allow for that, or a lift or something else that would accommodate them. And so, yes, diagnosis is the more kind of medicalised view, but you get people that identify as disabled, that use the kind of terminology of the social model that really allows for you to take on a disabled identity that recognises that. It's the whole person with a disability versus disabled person. Person with a disability, for many people, and I acknowledge it in the book, that it is the majority view, but there are, certainly in America, I think there is still the use of person with a disability, but here in the UK, disabled person is preferred because that really implies that we become disabled not because of a condition, but because of when we access these barriers. I can get about in life perfectly fine, but if I was to go to a film screening and there's no subtitles, then in that situation I become disabled, or if you like, my disability becomes visible because that access barrier is presenting itself, where otherwise it may not do.
Yeah. Now, we're talking a little bit about autism and ASD, but you also are a deaf person, which is also something you've had all your life.
Yes.
And so how was it for you growing up as a deaf child? And would you explain, you do have some hearing?
Yes.
Right? You're not completely deaf?
Yes. There is some kind of leftover or residual hearing that I have, which means that I can hear you. And obviously I wear hearing aids in both ears, which also helped me with hearing. Yes, so it was something that I've always had, as you kind of say. I'm fairly certain we had it since birth. I had a kind of difficult birth with forceps, which we think kind of contributed to the whole range of things, deafness, autism, dyspraxia as well. And yeah, growing up, it was a significant challenge, I think, because although actually it was more so the dyspraxia, but the idea that I had to wear hearing aids was very difficult for me at a time where I was pretty self-conscious. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence. That was through the result of bullying, through really struggling to fit in socially because of my dyspraxia and the social skills and social difficulties that presented. to then be kind of presented with this idea that I would have to wear two things in my ears that, that would have tubes coming out of them that would draw attention to that. It was quite a shock. It was a shock to the system having an audiologist turn around and say, you actually might benefit from this. But in time, not least because I was able to find my community, I always recommend that if someone is kind of in a position where they've had a new diagnosis or they've had this new information, to seek out the community that is building around that. There is almost always a community that is built around a certain label, identity. Finding that community can really help. For me, finding other deaf people, not least through a kind of charity youth board that I was part of with the National Deaf Children's Society, being involved with that brought me to meetings where I was meeting 17 or 18 deaf young people from across the UK. Some of them were sign language signers who I hadn't interacted with before, which then built up my knowledge of sign language, built my confidence in my deaf identity to the point that I can now proudly wear hearing aids without that sense of shame. So it was difficult to begin with, but to kind of find your footing, not least with the help of community, has been massively helpful.
Yeah, community is always such a great support, and like-minded people who can empathise, is usually hugely supportive. So growing up with a knowledge of your deafness, had you have had an autism diagnosis as a child, do you think that would have made you navigate life easier, or may that have made it more difficult?
It certainly would have given me a kind of some certainty, because in pursuing a diagnosis, or my parents pursuing a diagnosis for dyspraxia, the end result was that I was diagnosed with dyspraxia, but I was told I have traits of Asperger's syndrome. Very briefly, we try and distance ourselves from that quite considerably, not least because there has been recent studies and reports about Hans Asperger's alleged links to the Nazi regime and collusion with the Nazis. There's been some multiple different discussions around that, but I didn't necessarily like this idea, not least because of that label, but also just because this whole idea of, well, you might have autism, you might not have autism. It was, and you'd think as well with the framing that you have traits of something would surely indicate that you may well have it. I didn't quite like this grey area, which is, again, in itself a sign of being autistic. You don't like the middle ground so much. And so I think, we kind of then went about kind of assuming that I had communication difficulties, primarily through dyspraxia, but obviously now we'd realised that it was also autism. So I think from a very basic level, knowing that I was autistic in childhood would have given me that certainty to at least understand myself, because I'm now being late diagnosed, and obviously there are a lot of late diagnosed people out there, not least because of the delays facing the system, the health system with diagnosis here in the UK. I think I've had to do that kind of learning and understanding about myself in adulthood. And I do think that if I had that understanding and had gone through that process sooner, I'd been able to explain myself sooner. I'd been able to understand how I operate, the needs that I have, all of these different things much sooner, which would have then affected relationships and friendships and connections as a child that maybe weren't as strong as they could have been, or weren't as positive as they could have been, because there was that understanding.
So really what you're talking about is validation, because I know that's something that I found with my own mental health journey, was I considered myself weird, wrong, not fitting in. So I was a bad person, and I was putting that blame on myself, whereas I was going through a clinical issue that I couldn't control. Yes. And it wasn't until much later I recognized that I had not done anything wrong. I didn't ask for this. Yeah. This is who I am.
Yes.
And so to get that validation and to understand that, no, I am who I am, and, I well into adulthood before I learned that I'm actually a valuable person that can contribute a lot to society. And so I think having that validation is very valuable.
Absolutely. I mean, in addition to being deaf, dyspraxic, autistic, I also have obsessive compulsive disorder, and received diagnosis for that around kind of lockdown period. And that validation was overwhelming, because the way in which OCD manifests, not least kind of telling you you're a terrible person and really telling you falsehoods about your identity and your sense of self. You know, there's this term in the kind of OCD space and in the mental health space around OCD being ego dystonic, by which I mean, or by which it means that the thoughts that are being presented to you, these intrusive thoughts, are so averse to your morals and standards that is what makes them so disturbing and makes them so distressing. And so I was, for the longest time, kind of trying to dismiss these thoughts and bat them away in my head. And that involved a lot of mental energy. It meant that I wasn't really having the capacity to really feel like I was in the driver's seat with conversations. And so then having a doctor turn around and actually say it was OCD, which was already in itself quite a relief, not least because all the other times they were saying, do you have compulsions? And I was thinking, well, I was falling into those stereotypes of, well, I'm a bit messy, I'm not clean, so I don't fit that stereotype. I'm not very organised, I can be when necessary. So I was really kind of thinking about that and said, no, I don't have any compulsions. And that really kind of led a lot of the doctors that I saw and GPs that I spoke to kind of brush that away, until one doctor said, well, even if that doesn't manifest in the physical compulsions, you are still having to go to people and ask for reassurance. And so it will manifest in a different way. But to then have all these thoughts telling you that you're a terrible person, when actually you then get a diagnosis that tells you, no, you're not a terrible person, it's just the way your brain works, it's an indescribable relief to know that you are not your thoughts. Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, Liam, specifically about the book, how long was the book a work in process?
A very long work in process. So I was commissioned by my publishers, my excellent publishers, Jessica Kingsley Publishers, to start writing the book in April 2022, I believe. And it then became a year-long work in progress to get it round, to hand it in around that time, a year on, so April 2023. I then had to go through a number of rewrites and get different contributors in, take some out that weren't quite working, and put in a few more. And then off the back of that, there was some legal edits that had to be made. It turns out that going after anti-vaxxers and pointing out their kind of dangers and mistakes can get you into hot water legally, so I had to make sure that was okay. And the usual copy edits and making sure that everything was nice and concise, which then kind of, it took a while, but I'm not complaining that it took a while. It had to be thorough, it had to be meticulous. And it pushed the publication date back until November 2024. So it was a very long process after I had written it to then get it to the point where it was legally sound, the copy was nice and tight, and it came out in November 2024. And thankfully, a lot of the conversations do stand the test of time. There were some things which obviously tap into current affairs. There was some concern that some of the stuff might be outdated by the time it hits the press. But I've said to people there are two things in the book that I'm really happy if it does go out of date not long after the book, or even when I was writing it, which was Spectrum 10K, if that then gets shut down, which after publishing the book, just 2 months later it had been shut down. So I'm happy with that now. That yes, the book is slightly out of date and it doesn't mention that, but the study was so problematic that I'm taking that as a win irrespective of the book. The second is the Judge Rotenberg Centre in Massachusetts that electrocutes autistic children. That potentially will be banned come October this year, but that is to be set in stone. But thankfully, the book has stood the test of time despite its very lengthy writing process.
Well, I think anything which is factual, anything which is scientific is probably out of date the day after publication.
Yes.
You interviewed a lot of people. How many people did you talk to when you were doing research for the book?
Quite a lot. I would say, I don't have an exact figure. I've got a folder of all the interviews in my computer, which would give me a definitive answer, but it was certainly in the kind of tens or maybe even 20s of people. And it was a whole range of people. I wanted to make sure this book was as diverse as possible, not least because there are disparities within the autistic community and within autism research. We think about how the kind of immediate thought that comes to mind when we think about gender in autism is that it is a male condition, which is not the case. We see non-binary people diagnosed with autism. We see autistic girls as well. It doesn't help that one of the main kind of theories that was pushed by the industry that is talked about in this book is this idea of an extreme male brain. Autism is the extreme of the male brain. And even when you think about diagnostic criteria, we're still seeing questions around, I have an intense interest in cars, planes, or trains. And immediately thinking about gender stereotypes, to take a very stereotypical and slightly prejudiced view, cars, trains, and planes are more kind of leaning towards boys and men as opposed to girls. So it is interesting how that presents, but I wanted to make sure that we explored that. And so the real kind of nice range of interviewees looked at racialized autistic people, different genders, LGBTQ plus autistic people, to really get a sense of all of the different barriers that present themselves, because I don't think you can really present a real picture, a full picture of the problem unless you do that.
And in your opinion, how flawed has science been? I mean,
the book makes it much more explicit, but I think to give you a very brief rundown, I think there are a range of different concerns, but I think one that really springs to mind, which I've kind of coined the holistic irony, holistic meaning non-autistic, which I think is really ironic, is that we are seeing non-autistic researchers being reluctant to embrace change. And when you think about autistic people, one of the kind of defining characteristics or things that we often associate with being autistic is this kind of reluctance or kind of distress that is brought about by sudden change. If routines are scuppered, if plans have to change the last minute, it can be overwhelming, it can be really distressing. And yet, when we have been characterised by autism researchers as not being embracing of change, it's really interesting that when autistic people are now going to non-autistic researchers and saying, hey, this research that you're conducting is harmful, it's not valuable, it's not what we are after. I mean, I think immediately of one study that said that autistic people experience a range of complex human emotions. I mean, of course we do. We're not automatons. And so what's interesting is when this has been presented to autistic researchers, it's a shock to them, but they're either slow or outright reluctant or unwilling to then change their approach and change their research and really be more in tune with the needs and desires and priorities of the autistic community. So I think that is still an issue that we see today, where autism researchers are really just not listening to the needs of the community.
Yeah. And obviously you've studied the scientific side behind ASD, but I always think of these things as scientific and societal, because the subtitle of your book is How Science Lost the Trust of Autistic People and How It Can Win It Back. Yeah. Would you say it's fair that society in general has lost the trust of autistic people and people who are disabled?
So actually, I'd flip it the other way around. I'd say that autistic people and disabled people, there's still concerns that we have around how society is set up. I mean, like I talked about earlier about the social model of disability, there are attitudes and infrastructure that are established in society that aren't as accommodating for autistic people and disability more widely. And I think that will then obviously then manifest in institutions. We are untrusting of certain institutions. A lot of disabled people have issues with the NHS. Obviously it is an excellent institution in that it's obviously free at the point of use, and as that mindset and that mantra that's at its core, obviously that can't be faulted, and that's so important. But yeah, obviously everyone has their own experiences with that. And I think it's society has a long way to go. The researchers are a part of society, and often the research that autism researchers do feeds into societal attitudes and the approach and the kind of methodology or kind of the view of autism. And so there is that kind of symbiotic link. And I mean, where I kind of pinpoint the starting point of all of this is, and I'm sure there is things that predate that. I mean, Andrew Wakefield certainly wasn't the first kind of vaccine skeptic, but I kind of start by pointing at him and his research because it was that very first kind of defining moment that defined wrongly, I should immediately add, wrongly defined autism as a condition that then the autistic community was so frustrated with that trust then fractured.
Yeah. And you talk quite a bit about dehumanizing and stigmatizing the condition. And would you say it's fair that, that attitude can be applied to many other disabilities and certainly to mental health? Absolutely.
I mean, there's kind of 2 points on that. On the disability point, there is a way in which we, as a society, are still not seeing the kind of middle ground humanisation, if you like, of disabled people. We're still in this kind of binary where they are either people to be pitied or to kind of sympathise with and feel sorry for, as the kind of, and there's the extreme of that where it's not even past the point of, it's gone past the point of sympathy and pity to outright disgust and hatred. You think about the benefit scroungers narrative that is just so abhorrent in our society. But then you've also got the other end of the spectrum where, or the binary or the scale, if you like, where it's disabled people that are seen as inspirations or superheroes or, kind of superhumans, to use the phrasing that Channel 4 used until very recently for its Paralympic coverage. What we need to see is disability being seen as this very neutral thing. Like, obviously many people will have positive connections to disability, but that's not to say there are things that will trip us up. But that's exactly the point, that it's so neutral, it's so natural that it shouldn't be put on a pedestal, but equally it shouldn't be shunned. And so that's an interesting point on dehumanisation. But then, yes, also mental health is dehumanised, not least because, as we kind of both discussed at certain points, to kind of feel like an outsider and to feel like you're not part of a wider community because your psychology and the way that in which you think can set you aside, I think is really damaging. And I think you can certainly experience that when you experience depression, anxiety, OCD. You really do feel like you are distanced from everyone else because of the way that your mind works, because of that neurodivergence. And so, yeah, I think dehumanisation is a real issue that I think, also speaks to both disability and mental health. And there is the convergence of the two, not least when it comes to neurodiversity.
Yeah. Now, if you had to give a word of advice to somebody, maybe a child, a young person, an adult, who feels they may have autistic tendencies or has received a diagnosis and doesn't really know what to do, what type of advice would you give people?
I think it goes back to what I said earlier about finding your community, because that certainly helped me when I kind of got presented with this new identity and wasn't quite sure what to make of it. And so there are ways that you can do that. Charities are brilliant, not least because of the kind of masses of information that they have and collect and produce, which is great, because not least because it can often be that void of, or that kind of absence of information at the point of diagnosis that can really be distressing, that can be really isolating, that can be really disorientating. And I mean, in the book, I talk about how I would argue that is where Andrew Wakefield managed to kind of put his foot in the door, in that there was kind of such an absence of solidified, proper information about autism at the time, and it was so ambiguous that Andrew Wakefield was able to kind of step in and spread falsehoods. And so I think charities are great with providing that information that's factual and concise, but then also a lot of charities, they offer support groups, they offer community events, activities that will bring people and their families together to connect and to share common challenges, to share triumphs as well. Let's not just think about challenges, but also areas where they've succeeded and found workarounds for the barriers that they face. And so that would be my main point of advice: is find a community, and in whatever way that may be, working with charities, connecting with organisations. Social media is can be both a blessing and a curse, but not least in terms of community. It can be so easy to find communities online that will share information and support.
Somebody did tell me once, whatever it is that you have or you're concerned about, if you type that into Google and then the word forum, you'll probably find that there is a forum for it.
Yes, there's always somewhere to go, somewhere to look.
So, one last thing I'd like to ask before we wrap up is, what is your dream for the future for science surrounding autism and for autistic people? If you had to have a wish, what would it be?
I'm hoping I can get free, like all good genies.
Oh yeah, you can have
like all good genies will offer me. Yes. So I think there's a few. I mean, I said this earlier, and that there are kind of two things that I wish for the book to go out of date, and I've already kind of achieved one of those wishes, and that Spectrum 10K has been shut down as it should have done because it was so unworkable. The second is that the FDA, Food and Drug Administration in the US, bans the administration of electric shocks on autistic children. That is, well, as it stands, that's currently with the Food and Drug Administration again to introduce that ban. They're kind of giving me a date of October 2025. The only issue or concern that I have is that we are now in a new administration that has displayed a very clear disdain and dislike and, I'd argue, hatred of diversity, equity and inclusion, and how that presents itself. Also accessibility, and not least because the person that is now set to head up Health and Human Services is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's said a load of comments about autism that are not factual, neither factual nor pleasant. And so there is a concern for me that that ban could potentially not happen now because of who's in charge. That would be one wish. But more broadly, I think co-production is the underlying principle that underpins the autistic rights and advocacy, but also disability advocacy more broadly, because it does tap into this mantra that won't ever go away, and I'm glad it doesn't, because it's so important, which is nothing about us without us. You can't make decisions about autistic people, about disabled people, without involving autistic people and disabled people. And unfortunately, we've seen it with Spectrum 10K, we've seen it with other studies. Those are being carried out without the involvement, or at least as much involvement of autistic people as they should have been, or disabled people as they should have been. And so my hope going forward is that there is more co-production, because then when we have more co-production, the views of autistic people and disabled people are properly listened to, and we start to see a shift away from research that isn't in tune with the priorities of autistic people. This constant focus on cures, causation, all of the things that trigger autism, as opposed to more interesting research. There's people in the book were telling me that it's far more interesting and far more useful to talk about co-occurring conditions with autism. Autism and epilepsy is a big one, but also autism and mental health. Charities were telling me that the mental health impacts and mental health conditions and how they interact with autistic people and how they present themselves as autistic people, I should say, is just as important. And so we won't get there unless there are autistic people around the table, if you like, that are there to tell non-autistic researchers who are also on the study that is the direction in which we should be heading.
Yeah. Great theory, and I'm sure that you're going to be an advocate for this your entire life. I can tell that you're very committed to this and very passionate about it, and the world is fortunate to have people like yourself that are really behind this and really pushing for it. So once again, congratulations on the book, and maybe we'll sit here in a couple of years and talk about your next one.
I very much hope so. Thank you.
Well, thanks again, Liam. This has been great catching up with you. And thanks everybody for watching here. And I hope you've enjoyed listening to Liam. Please feel free to leave comments and subscribe to our channel. And until next time, be well, be happy.